Right, so we're moving swiftly on to our next panel, which is about, well, basically, how do we advance the technology frontier even further, and how do we make sure that this technological frontier is actually comes to market? And to help me discuss this, I have four speakers. I have Anuj Maheshwari, who is the Managing Director for Agribusiness and the Managing Director for Middle East and Africa at Temasek. Okay, here we go. Thank you. We have Katrina Hayter, who is the Challenge Director for Transforming Food and Production, the UK Research and Innovation. Jeffrey Simmons, the President and Chief Executive of Elanco. And Martin Goossens, who's the co-founder and principal of Antera Capital. Thank you all. So, thank you so much for coming. So we heard about a lot of the challenges. We sort of started sketching out some potential solutions. I would like to start with the basics, by which I mean basic science. So Katrina, UK Research and Innovation, you're basically tasked with ensuring that some of this basic science gets done. Well, first of all, so is enough of it being done? And second of all, what are the most exciting things in the lab that we should be looking out for in the coming years?
Okay. Is enough of it being done? Well, UK Research and Innovation is a funder of science and research. We manage a budget of about 7 billion each year, which sounds a lot, but actually really isn't. So I would say no, not a lot. Actually, more could be done. If we compare how much we invest as a nation in science and innovation, which is about 1.7%, compared to competitors like Israel or South Korea or Singapore, we are actually investing a relatively small amount of our GDP, so I think it could be more.
What about specifically for agricultural research?
Well, agricultural research, I don't have the figures on the top of my head, but I think historically has been relatively low, but that's changing, and that's why I'm so pleased that the UK government's industrial strategy has recognised agriculture as a key industry to invest in. And that's what I do at UK Research and Innovation. I manage an industrial strategy challenge fund focused on innovation and bringing the best ideas from the science base into industry so that we can create the new industries that we heard Sonia talking so eloquently about before, and also so we can transform existing and traditional agricultural systems so that they're more productive, but also so that they're on a trajectory to net zero.
So what are the exciting things that you're seeing in the lab and you want to bring to the market sooner rather than later?
Well, I don't think it's about a single technology as such.
Oh, come on.
No. For me, no, really, it's about the integration of them. That's when it gets really exciting. So when you put sensors with the Internet of Things, when you put that over the top of machine learning and data analytics, when you combine that in the production system, that's when you start getting this efficiency. And that's, we heard a lot about yields, and increasing yield is important, but I think the biggest gains we can get are in efficiency, and I think we're going to drive that efficiency through the application of precision data approaches. So for me, it is integration. Taking a technology lens or one technology, you're just tinkering around the edges.
So, well, what are the technologies that allow the integration? Because integration is a nice, fancy, sort of broad term.
Yeah. Okay.
What does it mean in practice?
So, okay, I'll give you an example of something I thought was really interesting the other day. I went to a field in Lincolnshire, and I went to a startup called Beehive Innovations, and they were working. They're completely technology agnostic, but they're working on potato production. And what they wanted to do was stop this waste that we get in potato production, which is where we just harvest the field and we take a couple of samples of potatoes, and some of them they look like, well, that's ready to harvest, but of course there's a lot of variability in the field. They were using LiDAR technology, radar technology, to look at how which parts of the field were ready to harvest and when, and they were using machine learning so that those systems could get smarter with experience. And they were looking at that across with a supplier called Branston, which supplies most of the potatoes to Tesco's and other major retailers. And it's when you kind of look at that sort of technology in a system, that's when I think it's really quite exciting. And it's less about the technology and more about finding the solution. So, it's not about data, or it's not about, a particular sort of spectral imagery. It's about, this is the problem, let's pull on those technologies, whatever they may be, to answer that challenge.
Jeffrey, since you're representative of a company which obviously uses science, a global leader in animal health industry, what do you see as the biggest barriers to more science flowing your way and getting out there in the market?
Yeah, I think the animal health industry has just in the last few years has totally transformed. We came out of agricultural chemical companies, pharmaceutical. We had 65 years inside a pharmaceutical company. We spun out as an IPO. We were one of the most oversubscribed companies. Why? The fundamentals. Protein. We can talk more about it, but animal-based protein and the growth of that is significant. We are going to need 70% more by 2050, but we're losing 20% to mortality and morbidity. So I always say capital markets reward fundamentals and facts that are real. Farmers, veterinarians are able to handle animal health issues, but they have challenges of realities of science, some of the practical things that were just talked about earlier. So I would just say, as an industry, as we come out on our own, we can now dedicate our own capital. In the last year, we've done 7 alliances with innovators out there, some even represented up here, to where we can actually drive a pipeline. And, back to your earlier question, I think when you look at just the agrobiome of the animal, how when you take antibiotics out, how that gut has changed, and being able to we have a product in Asia right now where we're taking, the bugs from certain chicken houses and creating tailored probiotics, tailored medicine in a way that the consumers want. But let's not get ahead of the science. I think that's important. And I think we should talk some about just animal protein as a whole is growing quickly, rapidly. Why? Not just GNP, that's growing, not just population growth, but I also think that, hey, we've got a Western diet that's changed a lot. As carbs and sugar have come down and animal protein's up. In the US, we're up 20 pounds per person. We'll consume more animal protein this year than any time in the history of man. Why? Because of a keto diet, because of a obesity problem with 13% increased obesity. So because of that, it's put pressure on the systems to be able to say, hey, we are not right now able to produce what's needed. And on top of that, in January, nobody knew about African swine fever. We've had the biggest epidemic that I've seen in 50 years, where we've lost 3 U.S. swine production equivalents in China overnight. And that means that a Chinese today is going to be 12 to 15 pounds short of protein this year that they can't get. Global protein prices are climbing, but we still have this barrier of about 20%, mortality, morbidity gap, because we're trying to give consumers what they're asking for, but the animals and the science have got to keep pace with that as well.
How do you marry that? Because we talked about intensification. Obviously, the closer the animals are to each other, the likelier it is that a disease will spread, presumably.
Yeah.
So how do you ensure that you can both intensify and keep animals healthy at the same time?
Yeah, don't underestimate. I think there's some here. I had dinner last night with some of the leaders in this country in terms of CEOs of major protein companies. I think the innovation in the area of husbandry of animals, if you look at chicken production, now there's, space and density is changing to make sure that animal well-being it's as good as it's ever been. And more space, I think that's a little bit where the narrative is not necessarily correct. I think inside the husbandry of some of the more sophisticated operations are actually doing a better job. And I think that's, to me, I don't think that's the case. I think China is a good example of African swine fever. More than half that industry was backyard farms. They had a biosecurity problem. That disease spread because trucks were going from small farm to small farm. I think what's going to happen now is we're going to see a more sophisticated pork industry in China that will create safer, more economically sustainable, and healthier animals long term.
Now I have a question for the 2 investors that I have on the panel, Martin and Anuj. So in the little sort of setup that I got from our organizers, I learned venture investors raised $1 billion or more than $1 billion in agtech capital. Now, that's trifling compared to the amount of venture capital that's sloshing around in things like, social media and sort of other, arguably less pressing issues and less important industries. It's probably more than it has ever been, but how do you get more money into this industry? And what are the exciting things, again, what are the exciting things that you as investors are looking out for? Martin, should we start with you?
Yeah, I think one important piece lies around investor education. So we as Antera are a specialist fund, and we felt there was a real need for a specialist fund that understands the dynamics of the food and agriculture supply chain. Because if we think about investing in the area of, say, the farm, there's a lot of influences that can impact the ultimate return on investment of a deal that you've made. And the external factors that you can think about are things like the weather that impact you. You have a cycle of a season, and so you can't reiterate like a minimal viable product in software, such as Facebook still is doing every day, and come out with a new version. You can't do that in agriculture. And you only have so many shots with the farmer as well, because the farmer sees his life as 40 shots at goal, and the farmer is not going to give you all of his or her fields straight from the get-go. So understanding those different dynamics as an investor and navigating those are important. I think what we see now with the first billion, and I think over the past 10 years, it came up from just a couple of million, so we're on the right trend. But to really have a big impact, it needs to go from 1 billion to 10 billion and even beyond that. And ultimately, it's bringing in the bigger pools of capital that can facilitate that growth profile. And I think that's an interesting place for where Anuj plays a role as well with bigger pools. Maybe it's a good segue.
Yeah, let me just build on that. So just stepping back, I think the last panel, very interesting. I think we need more food, we need better food, we need more environmental sustainable food. And I think most people will agree that we need technology to solve that problem. It's not going to be going back to old ways of doing things that is going to solve that problem. And where is that innovation capital coming from? We actually did this work about a year ago, and we looked at where does capital for R&D for agriculture and food. By the way, it's the full chain. You can't just say I'm solving the farmer's problem, the consumer will solve themselves for themselves. It's really Nestle on one end, Elanco or Bayer on another end. So we have to look at the whole chain, and that's what we do as Temasek. I'll talk about that in a bit. But we need capital. And traditionally, this capital came from two sources. The government was the primary driver of agricultural research around the world. And the second one was big, large companies. And if you look at a lot of published data which is out there, both of these spends are actually going down. The governments are slashing it. You can look at it in the USDA is the good example. The US is the biggest investor in agricultural research, and their spend year on year is actually going down. So is it in Brazil, so is it in other parts of the world. So that's worrying. Then you go to the big companies, that traditionally who were innovating, and you actually see that these companies are actually slowing down too. We did this survey of top 1,000 companies in the world. We took every company that was in the food sector, and we looked at all the companies outside of the sector. The average spending of R&D of companies, including car companies, battery companies, tire companies, is about 7% R&D spend. Guess what? It is for agri-food companies, average, less than 2%. But that's okay. And I'm not talking about the Facebooks and the Pfizers of the world, which are spending 15 to 18% of their investment into R&D. The worrying part is, if you look at the CAGR of this number, the 2%, the 7%, and 8%, the biggest companies are spending more on R&D. Of course, no surprises for that. The worrying part is this 2% number is actually growing at 3% per year, which is hardly inflation. And on an average, the median number across these 1,000 companies is about 7%. What the big picture is...
Did it used to be higher?
I don't have the data going back, but this is about 6 to 8 years. So it's not growing as fast. So what's happening? Naturally, market forces are working. These small startups from everywhere in the world, venture capitalists, are seeing the opportunity that the big guys are not innovating, the governments
Right.
are not coming up with it. There are problem statements that can be solved using technology, and they're going into it. I actually think the number of 1 billion that you put out there as agtech investments is, I don't know where you got it from, but it's far higher than that.
We'll find out.
Yeah.
Because
I would agree with that.
yeah, I think Temasek has invested over $5 billion in the last few years in this space. And why
Maybe
have
you're
we done?
responsible for most of it.
I don't think so, but we certainly have invested, because I know we have invested, so the number is more than $1 billion. So what's happening is these companies, these very agile companies, take a problem statement like I was hearing Sonia, vertical farming or what have you, and solving that problem. And that problem can be solved through technology. And when they go to the venture capitalists and say, hey, look, this is an addressable market, I can come up with X, Y, Z. Venture capitalists are saying, you know what, traditionally I used to invest in digital and social media and the next biotech drug, but I could invest over here as well. So venture capitalists are coming in. And these small companies are finally getting capital to innovate, which is fantastic. I think it is a call for big companies to now realize that they better wake up and start innovating, because they can't just be sitting over there and trying to play the cost game. It's all about cost. I just want to yeah, go ahead.
No, I have a question. No, I have a question about this, because so when you look, you said that big companies are spending very little. Whether or not that's not all of them.
Not all of them are.
On average. Are there any sort of structural reasons why they're spending little? And if there are structural reasons why they're spending little, are those structural reasons also reasons why startups wouldn't be investing?
Okay, so let me just answer that question, because I have thought about that. And Martins, you can answer that question after that.
And then Jeffrey can answer,
and then I can answer it again. So I think fundamentally, because we need to reimagine the food system. We have gone to believe that we need to feed the world, and it is just a quantity problem. And we've forgotten the quality of the food we produce, the nutritional aspect of it, the other aspects of it. As a result, a large part of the food industry and the agricultural industry is based on a commodity mindset, on a mindset of cost. And when you have a commodity and a cost mindset, why would you innovate? You will only take costs down. And unless we move from that, where people, and consumer has to go along with it. Consumer needs to start paying for the food they eat. If we are causing diseases by just feeding ourselves, we better be ready to pay for a better diet that we get as well. So to me, there's a fundamental reimagination that is needed in order to do that. But let me start over there and give it to Martins and then to others.
Yes, I think one key issue the industry has, and predominantly upstream looking at the life sciences companies in animal health and crop production, is that their R&D efficiency is going backwards. And that's one of the key reasons why they are spending less. Because
but that's a secular trend for all R&D.
Yeah, but if you look at, for example, let's take molecule development in crop protection. The cost to take a molecule to market today, on average, is roughly 300 million for development. And that it continues to go up, and it used to be a decade ago somewhere around 150 million. So that trajectory shows that the industry is not efficient anymore. And what we actually see, if we look again at animal health, there's the same pattern there. But what happened in human life sciences, if we go back to the 80s more or less, the human life sciences industry predominantly was dependent on internal innovation by the big corporates. But then they started to externalize innovation. So if you look, for example, at small molecule development and discovery, back in the 80s, it was more than 80% done by big corporates, 20% SMEs. Today, it's the other way around. And core to our thesis...
and then the big corporates come and buy out the small companies.
They come and buy out. It's exactly what's... Well, for example, Jeff and I were just talking about this. They just bought Prevtech Microbia, and they just bought another company, Aratana. And they've done all the development, and now Elanco can bring it further to market and use its distribution channel. But I think more and more innovation will have to come from those startups, because they have different models. And the second thing, which enables that today even more so than back in the 80s when the human pharma industry realized that, is that now we have the digital tools and biotechnology tools to far outpace innovation and discovery as we saw it before. And so access to those tools are more widely available to people. It's also the use of digital tools such as cloud computing. So all of a sudden, a small startup can start doing analysis on a huge set of different studies. Where I saw this quote from, was it Novartis the other day? They had done 40 years of research, and they then did that same data set of research within 4 hours for $4,000 on a cloud computing setup from AWS. So it's the combination of these digital and biotechnology tools that all of a sudden enable that. And I think the last thing to add is just one final quick thing is that these small companies are also able now to innovate without having to have all the infrastructure. So they can outsource to CROs, they can outsource the development and discovery. They almost can become virtual companies. And so therefore the capital need, although it's still high, is a lot lower than what it used to be.
I think it's an and game. There's no question. I would challenge back that I think more money is being funneled in than ever. If I look at animals and crops.
How much does Elanco spend?
So today we're in that 8 to 9, 10% depending. So if you look at when we get together with Bayer, it'll be over 400 million. Today it's about 250 million. But I think there's another, the end piece here is what are we really good at? You got to step back and I think say, we've got 11 species from salmon to sheep to, so you've got to be careful. On a human model, you've got one. So one is it's sophisticated.
I was always 50
in
awe
to 60
of
countries.
my friends who studied veterinary science, compared to medical doctors.
Yeah. So there's complexity here. So you got to pick where you're good, and there's economics to this. So late stage development, we're very good. We've got the animal models we can develop. We can go to 50 countries from a regulatory perspective. So to the point made, partnering earlier. I call it A&D, not just R&D. We acquire and develop. And so what our industry's done is, the top's consolidated. What are we good at? We've got the scale, the share of voice to get the innovation into the markets from Africa to Brazil. But what we need more partners. So the one example, we are putting money in funds because I think agriculture is behind on funding, partnering, and sourcing innovation. That's where we're behind human pharma, I think, is being able to put money in. We put money in a fund that started a company called Aratana. We took and partnered a product with a royalty, globalized it, gave them enough cash flow to build 5 more innovations, and we acquired them later into the market. Same with PrevTech. It doesn't even need to be an acquisition. It could be an acquisition of one product. So I think the partnering needs to happen and know in big companies what you're really good at. We're really good at poultry research, in the late stage development, putting the packages together, bringing them to the regulatory bodies and getting them approved. But we're open to source a new salmonella product or something, a new vaccine technology. So it's an and story. And I see funding going up. I see efficiency where you're really good getting even better. So I'm a lot more optimistic that pipelines have never been more full. It's matching to me the science and what consumers want and getting it globalized that's our challenge.
So Anders mentioned, we have to reimagine the problem in a way to come up with the solutions and reimagine the system. Katrina, what's the role of the public sector, organizations like yours, in reimagining this system? What can they do to make sure that this reimagined systems actually, comes to pass?
Yeah, so in our particular challenge, our Transforming Food Production Challenge, which is 90 million over 4 years, we're quite focused and structured in our investment, in that we want to invest in technologies that increase productivity, but at the same time help us meet our net zero obligations. So that is a caveat or a bow that we tie around our funding to ensure that that is driving towards resilient, affordable, sustainable production systems. I think we're fairly agnostic as whether it's novel production systems such as vertical farming or aquaculture or new sources of protein, or whether it's traditional systems. Because actually, you need both in tandem. You need a food system that works, that on the one hand, the novel systems smooth out those peaks and troughs that we heard that we're going to see more of as our climate becomes less predictable and more difficult to deal with. So I think that's the role that the government has. I think the government also has a thought leadership role in setting the ambition. The other thing that we can do around the startups, which I'm very pleased to hear there is such an upswing in capital investment for innovation, but I still see when I go out and talk to innovative startups and businesses around the UK, that they very much rely on our initial grant funding to de-risk those really early stages of innovation. And I would argue that there is a bit of a valley of death between, our grant funding and maybe some seed funding and then your kind of follow-on funding. So I would be really interested to hear from the panel how government can partner with you to get you to invest in earlier and wider so that we can get more of those really good ideas out into industry quicker.
Anuj, do you want to just weigh in on that?
Yeah, I'll weigh into that. So reimagining food and not just agriculture, for me, and I think this was talked about, is keeping up with the demographics, keeping up with how we're going to be living in cities. It is going to be more intensification of agriculture, and traditionally that has not gone well with the consumer. I think this was said. So the one thing that the startups will not be able to do or are not capable of doing is being able to bring the consumer along. The consumer has to be educated that responsible technology is good. Not everything will be done as GMO was done. You can take people along with it. There are risks. The risks can be taken care of. You have to educate. You have to tell people. One of the things in Singapore we are doing through public money is understanding the psychology of food. Why do people feel that when you say organic, they think about butterflies lying in or meadows, and so is salmonella is organic too, or so what is it about technology that cringes most people? And not. So how do you take consumers along? CRISPR-Cas is a good example.
What is it?
I will tell you when they find out, but I am sure it is a process of education. It is a process of education because food has to be medicine, and you have to educate consumers that it is okay to let technology have a play in it. So where I feel the governments have a role to play, the startups will innovate. And I agree with what Jeff said. It is in tandem. I think it's great what the startups are doing. Let's take an example of Impossible Foods. We are a big investor in we are an early investor in Impossible Foods, and we think it's a company that's solving some issues in a creative way, and so on and so forth. But one of the challenges is how do you communicate to the consumer? It always goes back to, is it healthy or not? And my answer is, when you eat a burger, do you really think about it's healthy or not? Because if it's not, so what I mean is you have to communicate with people.
That's really, really hard.
Yes.
That's much harder than technological development.
It is.
Social engineering is much harder than mechanical or biological engineering.
But that is the challenge.
But it starts early. I think we all need to be accountable that big company innovators in science, you can use GMO, you can use many examples. It was a mindset 10 years ago, as short as 10 years ago, if it's scientifically right, it's right, and we're just going to move on because we're right and society's got to catch up. That mindset is shifted, as we all know, vastly. Your economic models don't work without stopping and saying, what do consumers want? How do we launch and talk about products early is exactly right. Even existing products that are in the marketplace, how do we really talk about what those do and what they don't do, so I think we've got to introduce technology entirely different. Science is only one corner of the debate. There's a moral, there's the food consumer, there's environmental. So we need to now, I know when we're launching a product, we're 4 years from market. We've got consumer, research looking at what's in this product, what does it do? Productivity's bad, okay? What is it efficiency? We're looking at environmental claims, not productivity claims, if it can do something to carbon footprint, et cetera. So I think that's happening now in big companies because it's not working if it doesn't, and it's repositioning early.
So Martin, I wanted you to respond to Katrina's question as well.
Yeah, I think one final thing in my mind is that there's a big piece for education here to entrepreneurs and create more entrepreneurs at the early stage. I think if you think at government level, how can we work with universities, ultimately where the innovation should start? The US has done that very well, and I think if you look at the early boom in agtech, it happened much more so in the US. Partly because there's a way better ecosystem of entrepreneurs and repeat entrepreneurs. And if we want to have success stories that are backable, where more capital will flow into, you will need to incentivize people to move into a not so cushy job of a startup. But if we can convince people that that is actually the future, I think that is an important...
The problem with ecosystem is that they take a long time to evolve, right? I mean, not even build. Silicon Valley was helped along by the federal government, obviously, early on.
Yeah.
But it's a very organic, as it were, phenomenon that took 50 years to reach what it is today.
Yeah, but look at other verticals in Europe where Europe has excelled and is actually quite strong. For example, food delivery is an area where Europe was ahead of the US, and actually from a returns perspective has done a lot better than Grubhub in the US, for example. If you take Just Eat here in the UK, Delivery Hero in Germany, and Takeaway in the Netherlands, they all created local champions that were built over the past 15 years, more or less. And there's an offspring of all kind of other people that are coming from those companies rethinking about the supply chain. They're moving upstream, they're moving into the restaurant scene, they've moved to Deliveroo, they've moved into other models. So I think that's an area which is relevant to the food space. But fintech is another ecosystem where the European Union, especially here in London again, has created a unique ecosystem.
For the time being.
Yeah, but it's a unique ecosystem where I think you can then think about how do you apply that also to our space. So what is the crossover of fintech into the ag supply chain, especially when we think about farmers. Some farmers are even not able to get access to financing. So how can we access those different pools of capital? And ultimately, that will happen in general agtech, precision agtech as well. But we should learn from the other segments and get those entrepreneurs into the segments that we want them to go into to build more success stories.
I'll take a few questions from the floor. We have a gentleman there. And then a gentleman there. And this way as well. So I'll take these two first and then those two. The gentleman over there first. Thank you. Again, could you please just say who you are and whom you would like to ask a question?
Yeah, sure. My name's Albert Chung. I work at Bloomberg NEF. I come from the energy and climate sector. And here in the UK, we're one of the first countries to have a net zero emissions target for 2050 economy-wide. And so agricultural emissions had to get from about 10 or 11% of our emissions today, probably to a negative number, realistically, to support some other emissions in the rest of the economy. My question is, I mean, we've got 30 years to get there. My question is, where do we start, or has it even sunk in yet in your various sectors, and where do we start?
And then the second question here. Over here. Thank you.
My name is Alf Helgårdskog. I work for a company called Movi. Question goes back to the initial start of the conference, that the climate emission from food production is around 25%. You said 23, I think it's close to 25. Transportation is 15%. I have given up governments. I don't think they will change it. I think the lobby for red meat is very strong and will continue to not change that industry. So that is an issue. But I believe in consumers, and I in fact think consumers over time will change the food game. The question is, how will investors look upon where the food will come from going forward? We know that obviously that plant-based crops grown close to home is the best because of lack of transportation and so forth. We have not mentioned the ocean yet. The ocean stands for only 2% of the food. The most efficient protein converters are fish by far. We know wild fisheries will not be really the solution. That is like hunting back 10,000 years ago. So we're back to fish farming. I think that will come. And so how will investors?
So in other words, you want to know
how will investors play the game here in terms of
where
do they put the money?
How do they pick the right the right things to invest in other
Yeah.
words. Okay. So
Linking to climate change.
So the first two questions to anyone who wants to address this from the panel. How do you reduce? Has it sunk in that agricultural emissions must fall, and what are you doing about it to ensure that they're falling? And second of all, how do you pick the climatically most sustainable solutions, given that they aren't necessarily the ones which offer the greatest returns, I presume? Because if they offer the greatest returns, then that's not a problem. That's not a question. So.
I was with some of the largest beef and dairy farmers in this. So I'm going to be a little provocative here. I believe animals were the original recyclers of society's footprint, and I believe that animal agriculture actually has an opportunity to actually significantly change. So in the operations that I sat with last week, all of them have a vision and a roadmap to be greenhouse gas neutral or carbon neutral and in a foreseeable future. And it's a mix of cash cropping, it's a mix of better digestion, and we've got even innovations to where there's less emissions, carbon footprint, methane, and a reduction system, a syncing up with the timber industry to have a carbon sink as well. I think the whole area of anaerobic and digestive converters and what's happened there. We've just recently gotten a new product approved in the FDA that actually reduces ammonia. So when you put all of this together, these operations, all of them, were within a foreseeable future of actually being carbon neutral. I think also we got to remember 60% of the sheep industry, 60% of agricultural land is only available for grazing. 90% of what cows eat is inedible by humans. So I think and they're producing 20% more protein. So I think animal agriculture needs to grab a hold, and they are. The innovative ones are to say we have to be carbon neutral. We have to be greenhouse gas neutral. It's going to take productivity and efficiency, and this has to be something that's scalable, and measurable, and it has to have science around it. And so I'm going to turn and say I think animals are part of the solution. And I know you can say, well, that's not different. And I would even say, let's be careful. The measures are important. Plant processing. There's a researcher in Oxford doing studies that say plant-based protein puts out carbon dioxide that takes 100 years. Animals, methane's 10 years. We got to make sure we're thinking and measuring that carbon footprint, in all industries. So
I'll just add to that. So I think two questions. One is, can agriculture find a solution? In fact, can it be a negative? And then I think what you're saying is, what are investors doing about it? I can obviously talk about my firm over there. But I think given the movement we've had in the last 5 years, I think everybody's gotten the message. I think the agricultural businesses have gotten the message. The new generation knows what's happening, and they want to find a solution. And I am optimistic that the solutions will be found. I do have in my
Are they willing to pay for it?
I think it can come through different ways. It could come through, I think consumers should be willing to pay for it. I think companies should be willing to pay for it. Farmers should be willing to pay for it. But I'll tell you the biggest thing, in my opinion, the biggest subsidy in the world goes to agriculture. Take any country, pick your country, and tell me if you will not have the view around that. Why can't that subsidy be tied to the greenhouse emission of that farm, or that, why can't there be a tie-up? I think it's just a mechanism. I think the US, some of the Democrat candidates are already talking about it. I know of one particular company which is talking about starting to measure. First of all, let's start measuring.
Yeah.
If you have a cornfield, how much emission do you cause out of that cornfield? Measurement is the first thing, and then can you actually optimize it or decrease it? As you said, so I think I'm beginning to see that happening. You will see in the next few years companies in the animal health space who have now data capabilities. These are really tech companies. They're not just providing medicines, they're providing data to the farmer. Phenomenal progress that's going on in the Elanco's of the world, other companies we are investors in like Siva. And on the other side, if you look at the crop side, they are looking at it, let's start measuring, and let's start telling the regulators that you start giving subsidies on the basis of this. That's a brilliant solution. Nobody needs to pay for it. They're already getting paid for it. But let's look at the other side of the story. Innovation. Where's innovation happening? These are the kind of solutions that these startups are coming up with. We have an investment in a company called Pivot Bio. Very simple concept. we put nitrogen fertilizers into the ground. And that's a big cause of runoffs, energy, whatever you have. Our atmosphere is full of 79% nitrogen. But we still spray nitrogen into the ground and produce it through the bush process. They have engineered, for all the GMO haters, they have engineered a microbe that fixes the nitrogen from the air into a cornfield. And that microbe dies in a few days, so it doesn't have some of the issues with that. Now that is a fundamental solution that can take care of problems. We need to give these startups, these innovative companies, a chance. Investors will have to give it to them. Big companies will collaborate with them, and we will have, and the government needs to play into it. So
can this happen without sort of, because at the moment many of these solutions, because the carbon externality is not priced properly.
Fair enough. So that we have a problem.
You have a problem, right?
We have a problem. And look, that problem, I don't know who's going to solve that problem. Who talks about that problem? $2, $3, $5 for carbon is not going to solve a problem. It should be $50. But I think, or $100, as you say. But the other side of it is what our foundation, the Temasek Foundation, so we make investments, we want a return, we have a long-term view. But what our foundation is now thinking about is, how can we help create plants that sequester carbon faster into the air? Because agriculture should be putting back carbon into the ground. We've taken so much carbon back from the ground into the air. I think the roots are the best mechanisms to put it in. The trunks and the trees are too. So again, I think the answer is technology, responsible technology. I think investors have a role to play. I think investors are looking at it. I'm not a red meat hater as much as I'm a proponent of aquaculture, because it is sustainable, it is good, it's healthy. But
of Impossible Burgers.
Aquaculture in Singapore, we have developed a 9-story fish farm, and I think you might have seen it. So things are happening. I mean, of course, aquaculture.
It's important. I think the measurability is the greatest starting point. Where are we? Every large agricultural operation ought to know the measurability of that. But sustainability starts with economic sustainability. It's got to be practical, scalable. We've wasted a lot of money. We started this conversation about the efficiency of pipelines. Probably the most inefficient pipeline has been around the environment and chasing that. We need to be careful we don't just chase ideas. That's why you got to start with measurability. And if it's not economical, practical, scalable, the CEOs I was with last night, it has to be that first. And the science has to be real. And then we start to build systems and investors that are going to come, and I think that'll be. But if you miss those first sparks, I think we're going to waste. And we've seen a lot of companies not work environmentally because it was an idea people chased without knowing that.
I'm going to take a couple more questions from the floor because we're running out of time, and the two gentlemen there have been waiting very patiently. So each of you a question, please, and then we'll...
Owen Loudon, Innovator Capital. It's probably a question and a statement. I think there's probably two. I mean, we see two interlinked problems out day to day raising capital. The first, I agree with Anuj, which is a lack of capital in the space, particularly in companies which are pre-EBITDA positive but with initial sales. I think in other industries, such as pharma, as has been mentioned, you get multiple potential limited partners, and this industry is, I think, has a difference in that it's very consolidated. So that limits the amount of capital both going in as LP, but also provides fewer exit opportunities. So number one, we need to attract more financial LPs, such as Temasek, into the space. I think the sort of link to that is we've worked raising capital for some of the companies that have been discussed as being acquired by the panel, and one of the major challenges they find is in partnering with the industry in sales and distribution, and they will end up in early partnerships, but the incentivization through the sales is not there through the whole organization. So you end up with growth of 5-10% a year, where it should be 500% a year growth. So then you don't get the financial investors investing in those companies. So for me, it's a bit of it's a question of how do we change that? How do we encourage the partnerships that are successful with the growing companies, which will then bring more capital into the space?
So, and last question over there, on the table. Thank you.
My name's Jason Hartley from a company called Cultisan. It's a question maybe a challenge for Jeffrey, around this idea really that sometimes tech can look to profit over common sense. I'm a meat eater, but globally we put 56 billion animals a year to slaughter. Americans eat 50 billion burgers a year, and the average American will eat around about 220 pounds, maybe 100 kilos of meat a year, which is kind of an unsavory, unsustainable model. Now, I would think that the obvious solution to that, rather than innovate intensification of farming animals for profit, is just to eat less meat.
So Jeffrey, could we start with eating less meat?
So you gotta look at all the facts. So why is it growing so fast? Okay, I was in a pharmaceutical company, and you looked at oncology or cancer and diabetes, and what protein can do. Okay, and I think this is across the board from the standpoint of and why is it growing so fast? It's one, nutrition and the impact on the physical. I think cognitive skills, when you look at studies done in Kenya in terms of IQ scores up 15 to 20% in young kids. Stunting, protein has gone up in China, and the stunting issue of a 9-year-old boy's 3.5 inches taller now in China because of this. So there's physical, cognitive skills that I think are there. And then I would challenge, there's a lot of people saying our intellectual capacity could be limited if there is a change from the standpoint of just choline and B12. Now, I think it's got to be done responsibly. I do think that when you look at a chicken industry or an aqua industry, is that more sustainable in a mixed diet? But we're headed to 70% more protein by 2050. Put African swine fever on that, there will be a deficit of animal protein relative to what people want. So to me, that's more of a given. Now, how do we do it responsibly, more productively, with healthy animals, more sustainably? I think a plant-based protein, that you could argue is a processed food, no more nutrition, has some environmental footprint with it. It's about being responsible in every part of the diet, every part of the chain. But carbs are going down, sugar is going down, animal-based protein is going up. It's the fastest growing kind of food segment. Let's deal with the reality of how we do that responsibly. And I know that's a provocative statement, but look, taste, cost, nutrition always win, and the data is speaking for itself. So we can sit here in London in our bubble and say this is what we want to do, but there's a lot of people today, Chinese people today are going to be 15 pounds short of protein that they want this year right now. And so what I'm trying to do as an animal health company is deal with that reality. The 20% loss to mortality and morbidity is wrong. We got to fix that. So that's economics.
I would like you to answer the second part of the first question, which was about how do you make the partnerships lucrative for the startups so that they can actually attract investment on their own.
Yeah, I admit that there's challenges here. I think it's working so much better than it was 5 years ago. 5 years ago, you wouldn't have put an investment in the companies. Now I think we're starting to get some templates and models where they're working. But I think it's going to take more sources of funding, probably better early development in the research because it does this work. And then I think it's partners even in local markets internationally to move. But I think we're making progress. We're not there, but I'm excited. What I've seen in 5 years, we are an A&D company as much as an R&D company. We're willing to partner and acquire because we're really good at late stage development and launching. So,
Martin, I would like to.
Yes, so as an
I think this would be the last word.
As an investment fund, we realized quite early on that it's crucial to partner up with the different industry players such as Elanco to get these channels to market. And I think one of the first realizations was it's very hard for entrepreneurs to navigate within these big organizations and to know which doors to knock on. So we've made it crucial as part of our own strategy over the last decade to build out our Rolodex and know where those right doors are. Still, it doesn't go as fast as you want, but it helps. And you also see that these bigger organizations are trying to figure out how can we work and partner with groups. So I think it's improving. I think the second interesting trend, which can have a bigger impact and is already proven in some regions, is actually new business models such as e-commerce that could circumvent the traditional channels and can help you get direct to the farmer or direct to the consumer. And as an example, in China, which is arguably the most developed e-commerce environment in the world, I was speaking with one of Rabobank's global strategists based out of Hong Kong, who told me the other day that animal production farmers in that region are already sourcing more than 30% of their inputs via e-commerce channel. Because they have created the whole environment, they've integrated that with WeChat, with financial services, and I think that's ultimately where the future lies. It's not going to move as fast in Europe as it's going there, but I think that creates other opportunities and will help.
Right, well, this is a relatively positive note on which to end, and unfortunately we must, because you're all desperate for a coffee, I'm sure. So please, another warm round of applause for the panel, for a very, very lively discussion.